Welcome to Secure Freedom Radio and Securing America. We are thrilled to have with us a woman who I consider to be one of the most profoundly important and impactful public intellectuals in America. And she has been for quite some time. In fact, she's won the highly regarded Bradley Prize for this work that she does these days at the Manhattan Institute. She is one of the leading lights at its publications and has been just involved in really all of the most important public policy challenges of our time, and has brought, I think, both an enormous amount of common sense and some extraordinarily impressive research to bear to back up the position she strongly champions on behalf of, well, frankly, every red-blooded American patriot. And I'm very grateful to Heather McDonald, both for all that body of work and for coming to visit with us to talk a bit about it. This has not been easy. She's been extremely patient as we've tried to organize it, and I'm just extremely grateful. Thank you, Heather. Good to have you with us. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Frank. And I'm not as peripatetic as you are, so I don't have to deal with all of the connectivity challenges that you do when you're on the road. It is a challenge.
Heather, I'd like to get kind of for level.
Well, at least you've got the trucks.
I've gotten trucks. I'd like to level set with you on how you would characterize the state of our country at the moment in light of what I consider to be an unprecedented combination of enemies, foreign and domestic, seemingly intent jointly, wherever possible, to take us down. How do you see it?
Well, I think we're increasingly living lies, and we go through little dramatic fictions, theater projects to try and give significance to these lies. One of the most hilarious was the months of barbed wire and bollards and security gates around the Capitol after the January 6th riot, which was, a very serious incident. It should not be underplayed, but it also should not be overplayed. And the government and the media and the Democratic elites were thrilled with this moment because it allowed them to pretend that the biggest threat, domestic or foreign, facing the country was so-called white supremacy and white national terrorism, which is absolutely ludicrous. We had in 2020 the largest single one-year increase in homicide in this nation's history, 30%, which is a statistical change over a year in any context that is mind-boggling. You rarely get that significant a statistical increase. The bodies dead, an additional thousands and thousands of Black Americans killed by other Black criminals. That's the problem. The number of people killed by alleged white supremacists is a handful. And yet here we were with this pretend that we needed to lock down. And since January 6th, there's been various warnings from the federal government that, okay, it's happening again. It's happening again. Here come the white supremacists. We've got to put the barricades back up, which did happen in September.
It's happening now.
There's going to be some additional Trump riot. Yeah. Is it? Are they back up? That's right, for the speech. So all of this is our elites disconnected from reality and foisting on the public a lie. Another lie is the idea that anti-Asian hate crimes, which are on the rise, they're brutal, they're vicious, they're cowardly. You have had in Chicago, in San Francisco, and New York City, frail elderly Asians who are just pummeled struck to the ground, stomped on. We're also supposed to believe that that's white supremacists who are doing that, whereas the video shows it's overwhelmingly black thugs that are beating up on these Asians. And so when we had the Atlanta spa shootings of this young, uh, morally tormented white Christian guy who was in agony of guilt about his sexual cravings, and he opened fire at a massage parlor and sex parlor outside of Atlanta where he'd been soliciting prostitution. That was immediately slotted into the white supremacist narrative. It had nothing to do with race, with ethnicity, with nationality. It was all about his sexual torment. After the Atlanta shootings, he was on his way down to Florida to go after a porn studio. And yet the media ran with this story simply because it allowed them to continue this phony narrative. I see this happening again and again. The overarching, the most uh, fatal narrative that is taking down every institution in our society today is that of systemic racism, whether it's our STEM competitiveness, whether it's classical music, whether it's art museums, whether it's the quality of the federal judiciary, whether it's criminal law standards. Everything is coming down because of the idea that any civilizational, behavioral, or academic standard that has a disparate impact on blacks is by definition racist. And we would rather pretend that this is a white supremacist country than look head on at the inner city pathology, the pathological culture that is today giving rise to racial disparities. And so as long as the left controls the discourse and the only allowable explanation for ongoing racial disparities is racism, they win. I predict in a few years we will no longer have a White House. It's going to have to be called something else. I don't know if Washington, D.C. will hold on to its name much longer, but these are these symbolic mob destructions that pretend that Western civilization is the problem. It is not.
That was a splendid overview. Let me just start drilling down on a couple of pieces of this that I think are of just surpassing importance. Who is behind this? You mentioned the left. To what end are they fracturing our country, turning us against one another, uh, creating these false narratives of our intolerance, our racism, our enmity for one another? Is there some unified field theory as to why this is happening to us at this particular moment in time and at these hands?
Well, I don't think there's a plot. I don't think there's a conspiracy. I don't think anybody's gotten together to map out a strategy. I think there's these are long-standing ideological currents. Uh, the celebration of an oppositional culture that began in the 1960s, the hatred of bourgeois values by the baby boomers who then went on to struggle and voraciously seek material success and prosperity. But I think that the overwhelming impetus here is the problem of race in America. And I went on recently a audible listening jag to some of the classics of Black literature, whether it's uh, Man, Child, and Promised Land, or Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, Native Son, Malcolm X. Their eyes were watching God. And what I came away with there is that the conservative narrative about America and race is frankly a little bit of a whitewash. The conservative narrative is we paid our debt with the Civil War, then we passed the civil rights legislation, and it papers over the fact that really the cruel humiliation of blacks gratuitously continued well into the 1960s, 1970s, uh, in the North as well as the South, something that is so extraordinarily at odds with our founding ideals. So there's a reason why we have a deep well of guilt. That having been said, as unpredicted and predictable as it would have been in the 1960s to say that America would do a radical course change, that has happened. While I think that the part of the 1619 Project indictment of the racial divide being baked into the American identity. I mean, when you read accounts by Claude Brown of his treatment in the North, uh, in Harlem, the unnecessary put downs, there seems to be something about the white identity that needed to offset itself against Black inferiority. That having been admitted freely, we are the opposite of a racist society today. Black privilege is the reality everywhere. There is not a single mainstream institution that is not promoting, hiring Blacks that are less qualified, twisting itself into knots in order to achieve demographic parity and massively lowering academic and job qualifications to do so. America is absolutely ready to be post racial. What we see is after decades of trying to close the racial gap, there's no progress being made. And I think that the elites are terrified that that gap is not going to close. And they're terrified at alternative explanations to racism, whether it's culture or whether it's heritability. And so they are feverishly putting out there the prophylactically the only allowable explanation for these ongoing disparities. It's true, Blacks are overrepresented in prison. Why? Not because our criminal justice system is racist, but because they commit crime at astronomically, exponentially higher rates than whites and Asians. Blacks die of homicide between the ages of 10 and 34 at 13 times the rate of whites. Why? They're not being killed by cops. They're not being killed by whites. They're being killed by other Blacks who commit homicide at about 13 times the rate of whites. Black violent street crime today, the drive-by shootings, the robberies is almost exclusively the product of Blacks and Hispanics. Drive-by shootings are not happening in white neighborhoods. If they did, there would be a revolution. Nobody would put up with white children being gunned down in their beds and backyards. The media turns its eyes away because it does not want to. If you talk about Black victims, you have to talk about Black crime, and it's not going to do that. So there are real racial disparities. There are not 13% Blacks at Google. There are not 13% Black partners at Sullivan and Cromwell or Paul Weiss. The reason is not racism, it's the academic skills gap. Black 12th graders read at the average level of the white 8th graders. Black 8th graders, 54%, do not even possess partial mastery of the most basic 8th grade math
All right. So, but
skills.
let me ask you,
Those
Heather.
gaps never
Yeah.
close. So it is
But
preposterous.
is the
What?
reason why it's you know uh, such a disparate outcome of these educational systems, as many on the left would have us believe, of systemic racism or an effort to keep blacks down or otherwise deliberately and purposefully deny them opportunities. Your earlier comments suggest that's not the case, but connect those two dots if you would.
No, I'm often asked, well, what can we do to close this gap? And I'm sick of the question. There's nothing that quote unquote we can do much longer. We have been trying for decades, whether it's massive redistribution of wealth, urban schools are funded on a per capita student basis at much higher rates than than suburban schools. Uh, each side has had its own solutions, whether it's charter schools and vouchers on the right or more funding on the left. Both have been tried. I don't know a single wealthy donor in Manhattan, a Republican who does not have a raft of social uplift programs in the ghetto, whether it's chess, after school programs, tutoring. Uh, this has been an obsession of American philanthropy, of American public policy. The idea that we are turning our backs away from this yawning skills gap and culture gap is ludicrous. But at this point, I don't think there's much more that policy can do. The change has to come from within the community. And the most fatal norm that exists in inner city communities now, and that spreads out even into the middle class, is the stigma against so-called acting white. The idea that if you put in effort in your schoolwork, you are simply acting white, and that that's a betrayal of your race, and that prevents people from putting in the necessary effort. I've proposed a thought experiment to assess whether the left's explanation of massive systemic racism uh, is necessary at this point to explain ongoing racial disparities. If blacks acted like Asians for 10 or 15 years in all things related to economic and academic and life success, if they stayed in school, if they took their textbooks home to study, if they did their homework, if they paid attention in class, didn't beat up on their teacher, didn't join gangs, didn't take drugs, didn't get involved in the drug trade, didn't have children out of wedlock, and we still saw these racial disparities, then it would be time to start talking about systemic racism. But when the behavioral disparities are so large and so patent, it's way premature to invoke this sort of miasmatic explanation of, well, it's just something in the ether that is preventing people from getting ahead, when in fact it is, in many cases, a lack of a culture that values personal responsibility, deferred gratification, those bourgeois values that Edward Banfield wrote about in the Unheavenly
Mm.
City.
Heather, again, so much to work through there, but I mean, again, brilliantly spoken and courageously so as well. So let me draw you out on a proposition. You say there's no grand conspiracy, and I'm not suggesting it's necessarily a conspiracy, but it does seem to me as though this desire to take down the United States of America as we have known it animates certainly foreign adversaries of this country, ideologically on the left, most of them, communists, notably, the Chinese communists, most especially, and uh, individuals and front groups and other institutions that have, and I would actually suggest some of those philanthropies that you're talking about, that have made common cause towards this end, and as a result, this idea that the United States is a systemically racist nation seems to, as my friend G. Van Fleet has pointed out, victim of the Cultural Revolution in Mao's China. This is Maoism. This is a deliberate effort to use not class warfare, but race for this society, which doesn't have so much class as it has had these racial difficulties, as you say. And and this is part and parcel of a kind of inside outside game to fundamentally transform our country. And I just want to go back to what you said, speak to that if you would, but also it seemed to me, Heather McDonald, that when the United States electorate voted for Barack Obama to be the president of the United States, it was in part because not just black people voted for him or other people of color, as they say, but white people voted for him as a demonstration that we were in a post racial era in our country. and that he, it seems to me, through his attacks on the police and his desire, well, as he said himself, to fundamentally transform America, sort of brought us back into this, well, sort of Maoist prone environment. So, your thoughts on those two propositions?
Well, I don't expect our enemies to be in favor of American success. So that's separate. What is unique about this moment, I think, in world history is you have the elites turning on their own culture. And I don't think there's precedent for that. The Chinese Cultural Revolution was the sort of the mob turning on the elites and tearing down academic learning, and professors were pummeled in this leveling instinct. But now you have the elites who are happily embracing the idea that America is incapable of being just, of living up to its ideals of due process and tolerance and equality. And children are being taught that there is nothing good in Western civilization. That's also an experiment. What will happen to those children that have been given nothing to be proud about unless they can grasp on to some sort of victim identity, in which case they will narcissistically, uh, you know, uh, they've got their uh, ticket to success in pretending to be oppressed in this society, which in almost all cases is a complete fiction. I think what we're seeing is a hatred for a civilization deemed too white and too male. Uh, Females are taking it down as well. I think that the dominance of the universities by females explains a lot about their radical lurch even further left than anybody would have expected in the 1960s and 1970s. Females are behind the squelching of open discourse there. And uh, our culture, civilization, by demographic necessity, was overwhelmingly created as a European civilization by whites and males. That's just the facts. There was there wasn't a whole lot of racial and ethnic diversity outside of a very broad category over thousands of years of European history. But it's a lot easier to tear something down than to create anything that can possibly compete with those achievements. So it's a very strange thing, and it makes me sick to see the speed with which our greatest institutions, again, whether it's art or classical music or literature, are all being tarred with this phony brush of racism, and children are being taught to they're being given excuse for their own ignorance. Why should they learn about Mozart or Haydn if these are dismissed as simply dead
Dead
white
white males,
males?
right?
Why should they go in an art museum if they're told it's just going to be about silencing
Mm-hmm.
voices?
Heather McDonald, we've run out of time long before we've run out of wonderful things to visit with you about. I hope you'll come back. This has been so bracing, and I think that nobody speaks truth to power as elegantly and as compellingly as you do. And as a result, it is, a privilege to have an opportunity to chat, and I know my audience feels the same, and I hope we'll have a chance to do so again in the near future. In the meantime, God bless you, and go forth and multiply, as they say. We'll talk soon. Next up, Robert Spencer joins us. We'll talk about jihad, among
Thank
other
you,
things,
Frank. I
right
appreciate it.
after this.